Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're here to join us. So thank you for joining us today for our Grief Sensitivity Virtual Learning Institute. This is the first part of a two-part series. The second part of the series is November 12th and 13th. The focus of this institute is on supporting those individuals experiencing grief and loss during COVID-19 and beyond. We're so glad you're here with us today. Next slide, please. So hello everyone, welcome. My name is Dr. Mindy Chadwell and I'm a faculty trainer for the Mid-America Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. I'm pleased to be your host for this conference session and I'm excited to introduce this session entitled Supporting Students with Grief and Loss During the COVID-19 Pandemic. I want to thank our wonderful speaker for being here with us today and a big thank you to all of you for joining us. We truly hope you find today's presentation engaging and helpful in your work. Next slide, please. So to start off, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. We have made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information. All attendees are muted for today's presentation and cannot share video. If you have a question for the presenter, please use the Q&A pod. If you have a comment or link for all attendees, please go ahead and use the chat box feature. The session recording and slide deck will be posted on our website within about 1 week, so you can look for it there. If you attend at least half of the session today, you will receive an email following the presentation on how to access a certificate of attendance. And this event is captioned, so to view captions, click the arrow beside the CC box at the bottom of your screen and choose Show Subtitles. If you'd like to change the size of the subtitles, click the arrow next to the CC box and choose Subtitle Settings, where you'll find the option to make the subtitles smaller or larger. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media and stay in touch with us. Next slide. We just released a series of fact sheets focused on addressing various grief-related topics, including defining grief, responses to grief across the lifespan, preventive strategies and protective factors, cultural responsiveness, and evidence-based treatments. You can check those out on our Responding to COVID-19 Grief, Loss, and Bereavement webpage, as well as additional information for more MHTTC events and resources. Next slide, please. And we do want to recognize that participating in this and our other sessions may activate your own grief and feelings of loss. As mental health care providers, we also need to care for ourselves. Please monitor yourself and practice good self-care, including taking breaks, stretching, drinking plenty of fluids, and practicing mindfulness or whatever helps you in staying centered and grounded. If needed, here are links to helplines and hotlines, and these are also listed on the Learning Institute website. Next slide. Our SAMHSA-funded MHTTC network focuses on technology transfer, which means the adoption and implementation of evidence-based practices for mental health across the U.S. states and territories. We develop and disseminate resources and provide free local and regional training and technical assistance for the mental health workforce. Next slide, please. And here is our lovely map displaying the centers that make up the MHTTC network. We have 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Please visit our website and find your center so you may stay up to date on trainings and resources offered in your region. Next slide. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in the presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Next slide. Okay, before we go ahead and get started, I'm going to do an additional poll. This should be coming up on your screen here. Okay, I'm actually going, so it looks like, let's see here. So current plans for the school in terms of instruction for the 2020 and 2021 school year, we have some people doing in-person classes. We have a large percentage doing remote instruction, and about 32% are doing a hybrid model. And then it looks like we have had some experience with deaths related to COVID-19, as well as other causes. I'm going to share those results again. Okay. Now I'd like to turn it on over to get started. We have an amazing presenter starting us off today. The next slide, please. Dr. David Schoenfeld is our speaker today. He has established and directs the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, located at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. He is a professor of clinical pediatrics at Keck School of Medicine. For over 30 years, he has provided consultation and training to schools on supporting students and staff at times of crisis and loss in the aftermath of numerous school crisis events and disasters within the United States and abroad. Dr. Schoenfeld frequently speaks with over 1,000 presentations on the topics of crisis and loss, and has authored more than 150 scholarly articles, book chapters, and books. We are so delighted to have you with us today. I will go ahead and pass it off to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the introduction. So as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how do we support students that are coping with grief and loss during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I want to say that even outside the context of a crisis and this pandemic, loss related to death is actually very common in the lives of children in the United States. 5% of children in the US experience the death of a parent by the time they reach 16 years of age, and about 9 out of 10 children will report that they experience the death of a family member or friend by at least the time they complete high school. Now, this high frequency of loss among children is actually contrasted by the limited preparedness of classroom educators and other school staff to support these grieving students. In a survey that was done by the American Federation of Teachers, they found that 93% of classroom educators reported that they had never received any training on how to support a grieving student throughout their pre-service education and in-service education. That was the primary reason why they didn't often reach out to students, was because they felt they didn't know what to say or how to do that. Now, it is true that most children do adjust to even a major loss, but that doesn't mean that they don't grieve, and it doesn't mean that grieving isn't extremely difficult. Bereavement, we know, has a significant and often long-term impact on learning, social and emotional development, behavior, and adjustment. Now, the pandemic that we're going through right now is causing a large number of deaths. As already mentioned, a good percent of you participating are already aware of children in your schools or classes that have been impacted either directly by COVID-19, related deaths, or from other deaths. So what I want to do, though, is begin by talking about how do we support grieving children in general, not just in the context of the pandemic. And then I'm going to talk about the unique challenges of supporting grieving students during a pandemic. And then I'll offer some free resources for addressing these unique challenges that were prepared by the Coalition to support grieving students. Now, first we should recognize that schools can and often do provide a very supportive environment to grieving students. But this doesn't require that classroom educators provide bereavement counseling, but rather that they provide an empathic presence. I was interviewing one teacher, and she told me that she had a student who was out for about a week because his mother was ill, and his mother had been admitted to the hospital. But it wasn't until he returned to class that the teacher actually learned that his mother had died. And she said she was very taken back by that. She wasn't prepared for it, and said something to the effect of, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know that that had happened." And she tried to provide some support and assistance to him. And he just looked at her and said, "Please don't do this." I think it was a middle school child. And so she had said, "Okay, that's fine." And she said, "But please know that I'm always here for you. My door is always open." And that's the case for everyone in the school. You just let us know if we need anything, you need anything that we can help you with. Well, apparently he did not ask for any additional support, but about 2 weeks later, he stopped by after school and just said, "I just wanted to stop by and say thank you." And she looked at him and said, "Thank you for what?" And he just said, "I just wanted to say thanks." So she said, "Okay, I don't even know what you're thanking me for, but you're welcome." And apparently he just said, "You were here and I didn't have to talk about it." So she said she realized then that sometimes that's really all kids want, is they want to have their loss recognized. They want to know that adults care and that they're available, but they don't necessarily want to talk about it. And she said that she considers it like a dance. She said she'll take the first step. If the student takes the next step, they'll continue the dance. If not, that's okay. They can stop and just listen to the music together. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing in schools as students return into classrooms, whether that be in person, remotely, or hybrid. It's going to be a lot of just listening to the music together. And we need to recognize that is extremely important and supportive of children. So let's go over what you need to do. So first, it's important to acknowledge the loss. There's a common myth that talking to grieving children is just going to upset them. But when you ask children how they're doing after they've experienced a significant loss, and if they start crying, they're not crying because the question's upsetting. They're crying because you've given them an invitation to share how they were already feeling. So what we want to do is acknowledge the loss first. Now, many children and families, though, may not even notify the school when a death has occurred. And many children and adolescents who are grieving may not actually appear to be grieving. So let me go over why that might happen. Well, the first is that from a very young age, adults may unintentionally communicate to children that death is not something that should be openly discussed. If you think about it, if you're in the grocery store and a 5-year-old comes up to you and says, you know, my name's Tommy, my mommy's gonna have a baby, most strangers will engage in conversation, at least outside of the pandemic, when we were able to interact more in person. But they'd continue the conversation. They'd say, you know, is it going to be a boy or a girl? Are you looking forward to being a big brother? But when Tommy comes up to someone in the grocery store after death has occurred and says, I'm going to my brother's funeral, most people don't continue the conversation. And children learn from a very young age, actually, it's not something you should talk about in public. The problem is, it's also something that's hard to talk about privately. So when children do get notified that a close family member has died, they often will ask questions, as you would imagine. So let's say a mother has to notify her son that the father just died, her husband, and she explains it as best she can, and then the child looks at her and said, Mom, does that mean that Dad's not going to be home for my birthday next week? What usually happens then is the mother starts crying. And the child, because they're very egocentric, will often assume, I did something naughty, I made mommy cry, I won't do that again. And will often turn around and try and support and reassure the parent. And might make comments like, it's okay, Mom, we're gonna be okay. I can do everything that Daddy did. I'll learn to make dinner, you know, I'll help out in the house. And that may give the false impression to the parent that actually the child is not grieving or is coping better than they actually are. And this is not just young children. The same thing happens with older kids. I was seeing one adolescent, what had happened was his brother had died in an accident, and he was about 16 years of age, and this was an older brother. And the mother worked in the hospital I worked at the time, and she had taken about 2 months off because of feeling very overwhelmed about this experience. And then she returned back to work, and she was back at work for about 3 weeks, and then she came to meet with me. And she said she was really worried about her 16-year-old son. And she said he seemed to be doing well for a while, but now all of a sudden he's just not sleeping well, he's having trouble eating, he's not paying attention well in class, he's having nightmares. And so she brought him in to meet with me, and I asked what happened, and he said the same thing. I was doing fine for about 2 months, and then all of a sudden I just wasn't doing well. And I asked him, why do you think that is? And he said, I have no idea. And I just looked at him and I said, sometimes it's hard to see your mother grieve. And he just looked at me and he said, if I had one more night where she cried herself to sleep on my shoulder, I was going to lose it. Now, both parents were in the home, and I think the dad was supportive as well. But this was a very empathic 16-year-old. And I could tell that just from meeting with him once. And clearly his mother was using him for a lot of support, to the point where he didn't actually feel he could even start to grieve himself. So you will find children at all ages, as well as adults, often will not start their own grief if they're supporting someone else who they feel that that's what they have to focus on. Now, there are, though, other reasons why children may not appear grieving. Very young children may not actually understand what's happened, or at least not understand all its implications. When somebody dies, people lose the person that they care about. That's the primary loss. But they also lose everything that person did for them, could have done for them, or might do for them in the future. We call those the secondary losses. Children do not always anticipate the secondary losses right away. I remember talking to a father of 2 young children. His wife had died in a car accident. And when I met with him, I asked him how he was doing, and he just looked at me and he said, "I live in dread of the day my daughter has her first period. Her mother should be there to support her with that. I don't think I can do that." Now, his daughter was 5 years old, so I assure you she was not thinking about that at the time. But when she gets older, and when she does have that experience, I also anticipate she will miss her mother acutely at that time, but she's not thinking about that yet. Adults tend to anticipate the secondary losses more, and as a result, they understand more thoroughly the full magnitude of the death and what impact it's going to have on them. But children tend to grow into their grief as they start to understand more about it. But the issue is that children may also understand, but they may understand the implications as well, but they may be so overwhelmed by those feelings that they don't feel they can even start to think about it in a school setting. I noticed a lot of you were school social workers or counselors or other mental health professionals in school. So even if you meet with children alone in your office, if you were able to do that, they recognize the fact that they have to leave the office and go back to the classroom setting afterwards. And they may not think they're going to be able to hold it together if they start that conversation. So they may simply conclude it's best not to even try and broach the topic when they're in school. And some children also express their grief indirectly through their behavior, or they attempt to work it out through their play. There are many games that children play where death is a theme. There's actually one game which I'm sure you have all played with a very young child, where that's been called one of the first games about death that children play. And what happens is it's when children start to develop object permanence in the second half of the first year of life, they start to recognize that there are people that are important to them, attachment figures, and that they exist even when they're out of sight, and they can also cease to exist permanently. And once they start to develop object permanence, they start to worry about permanent loss, and death, of course, is what that permanent loss is often from. So if you think about a very young child, say they're 2 or 3 months of age, we tend to think that out of sight is literally out of mind. So when a caregiver leaves their sight, they don't continue to think about them. But by about 6 months to 9 months of age, they start to recognize that individuals who are not in the room and are not visible may still exist, and they worry about them and wish to be reunited. That's why 9-month-olds will start crying in the middle of the night until they're reunited with important caregivers, because they're worried that they're gone and they want them back. And so at that point, in every culture in the world, children start playing the same game. In the United States, we call it peekaboo. And in peekaboo, what happens is the child fixes their gaze on someone, can be an attachment figure, but it can also be someone else. There's then separation, as if the person has died. There's then heightened concern and awareness, and then joy at reunion. And they play it over and over. We should always ask ourselves, if all children at the same developmental period play the same game so frequently, and it's so compelling to them, why is that? That should be the question we ask. And people have said it's because they're afraid of death. And so if you think that's far-fetched, I will point out that if you translate peekaboo literally from Old English, what you are saying is alive or dead. That's what the game is about. And so that's just one of many games that children play about death. Spending time going over that, even though I know you probably are unlikely to be interacting with many 9 to 12-month-olds or 15-month-olds in your school setting. But if you are interacting with 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and 6-year-olds, and parents tell you that it's too young to talk to children about death, please understand we've been having those conversations with children when they've been below 1 year of age. Now, what you will also find is that students who can't communicate well verbally, such as students with intellectual and neurodevelopmental disabilities, will often express their distress in nonverbal ways as well. such as showing more aggressive or disruptive behavior. They can develop changes in their sleep, eating, or toileting patterns. Some students may increase their self-stimulatory behaviors, so they may rock, chew on clothes or fingers, or just become more intolerant of changes in routine. So you need to be looking for other types of cues with children who can't communicate verbally. I remember hearing about one child. He had severe autism spectrum disorder, and his mother had died. And sometime after his mother had died, he started to increase his head banging. So they were concerned that maybe he had a headache, and they ended up doing, I think, an MRI of his head to make sure that he didn't have any problem. It was persistent head banging that he was having. They checked for ear infections. When they couldn't find a cause, they eventually admitted him to the hospital for further medical workup because he couldn't communicate verbally what was bothering him. And it wasn't until he was in the hospital that someone recognized that he actually banged his head more when anyone mentioned his mother. And so that was the way he showed he was grieving. Once they figured that out, they discharged him because, of course, hospitalizing a child leads to more separation. Obviously, if they're grieving, that's probably the last thing that they need. Now, I do want to point out that just because these children don't necessarily communicate clearly their distress, it doesn't mean that they don't experience stress when they're grieving. Common stressors for children with ASD include unexpected events, disruptions in routine, changes in the behaviors of family or peers, powerful emotions, challenges trying to communicate their thoughts and feelings, and facing new sensory demands. And the death of someone close to them brings challenges in every one of those areas. Now, and I'm happy to talk about more questions related to children with unique needs later in the question and answer section. And as a developmental behavioral pediatrician, we often see children clinically for these type of concerns. Now, I do want to point out that children and adolescents and adults who are grieving, understand it, are capable of communicating it, may still choose not to. Loss is a private experience and grief is personal. I did a lot of work with New York City schools after September 11th, 2001. And what we found was that there were a number of children whose families had a conversation and actively decided not to disclose that a parent had died in the World Trade Center attack because the kids said they didn't want to be one of the 9/11 kids in New York City schools. And I expect we will see that with the pandemic as well, particularly since I think some people will feel their stigma or fear associated with having a family member die from a virus that is still circulating and causing problems during this pandemic. So for a lot of reasons, I've spent a lot of time on the fact that kids may not appear to be grieving, but they probably are if they've experienced significant losses. Now, many adults don't think they know what to say to make things better, and they're often afraid they're just going to say the wrong thing and unnecessarily upset children and make matters worse. And so that's one of the main reasons I'm told by educators that they don't say anything at all. So I often find it helpful to review some well-intentioned comments that may actually not be the best to share with grieving students. And I've listed some of these on this slide. First off, we don't want to cheer up survivors by making statements such as, I know it hurts right now, but I know you're going to feel better within a short period of time. Instead, we should just allow them to experience and express their grief. In fact, anything that begins with "at least" should probably be reconsidered. At least he's not in pain anymore, or at least you still have a sister, or any of these comments that try and minimize the experience of their loss is not helpful to the children. In fact, the reason it generally occurs is that the observer is uncomfortable viewing the distress and they want it to stop. So they try and cheer the person up so they feel they've done something to help them, but mostly what they've done is something to help themselves as the observer. We don't want to encourage children to be strong or cover up their emotions. We want them to be able to express them so we can help them cope with it. You should feel free to express your own feelings and to demonstrate empathy, but I don't think you should state you know exactly how someone else feels. Comments such as, "I realize this must be extremely difficult for you," or "I can only begin to imagine what you and your family are going through," are very good beginning statements that demonstrate empathy. But I would avoid statements such as, "I know exactly what you're going through." Even if you had someone else die from exactly the same cause, you can't really know how they're feeling. You should ask them. You don't want to say things like you must be angry. You want the individual to express their own feelings. You don't want to tell the person how they ought to feel. It's also best to avoid comments such as both of my parents died when I was your age. Now, I think there's a tendency for people to share their personal loss experiences to try and connect with students who are also grieving. I see this particularly among individuals who are not clinically trained and who don't feel comfortable in this topic area. So they draw on their personal experience instead of their knowledge about really what's best to do. There's a problem with that. Whenever you share and focus on your personal loss experience with a child who is acutely grieving, you make a comparison. And there's really only two ways that can go. Either you're going to say something that pales in comparison, and that can be insulting. I had one nurse who actually said to a family whose infant had just died, "I know what you're going through, my dog died this weekend." And they were just deeply insulted by that comparison. But the alternative can also happen. A child could come in and tell you that their dog died, or let's say a more distant family member. And if the educator or school mental health provider says, well, actually, my mother just died this weekend because of COVID, they may actually feel that your loss experience is greater than theirs. And they may then feel that they need to turn the attention to supporting you. Now, these things, all of these things that I've said you should reconsider saying, I'm just suggesting they should be reconsidered. There are situations where it's appropriate. And certainly, if you are talking to your own family member, peers, your own children, you will share your personal experiences and try and seek and obtain their support. You try and give mutual support to your friends and peers and colleagues. But if you are hired as a professional in a school to support the needs of a student, to be crass, not to be crass, it's really all about them and their experience. So what I would say in general, I would avoid sharing your personal loss experiences and instead keep the focus on the child and the child's own experiences. What you really need to do is just allow the child to be upset while suspending judgment. And I would intervene only when safety or health is a concern, when children are first acutely grieving. But I do want to point out that there are emergencies and they need to be treated seriously, even in the context of acute grief. So suicidal or homicidal thoughts or behaviors should be promptly evaluated by a mental health professional, and you should be telling classroom educators, if you're a mental health professional, to please let you know whenever that does occur. You know, I often tell a story. I was, as a favor to a colleague, I was providing some remote support. This was before the pandemic, many years ago, by phone across the country to a family that was that had just experienced, the youngest child in the family had a recurrence of a brain tumor and was doing poorly. And so I provided support to the mother by phone for a number of months just to help her through that experience. And then the child died. And then I provided some continued support just to help support her with the grief she was experiencing. A couple months after the death, she just commented to me, and it was like a Friday night, and she just said, you know, my older daughter, she actually was so upset about this that she commented that she was thinking of killing herself. And I remember I said to her, what have you done about that? And she said, well, nothing. That's what children think when someone's grieving. And I said, we can never assume that. And so I said, you know, you need to bring her to go talk with someone. She said, well, this comment was 3 weeks ago. And she's already asleep now. There's a time difference. So it was late there on a Friday night. And she said, I'm not going to wake her up to ask her about a comment she made, you know, several weeks ago. She's never repeated it. And I said, okay, well, you should bring her to see someone when she wakes up. And the mother just said to me, I'm not bringing her in on the weekend about a comment that she's made. So, you know, she agreed to bring her in on Monday morning to see her pediatrician. And so I said to her, well, over the weekend, let's make sure she's safe. And so they did not have any firearms in the house. And then I asked about prescription medications. And I told her that as soon as she got off the phone call, I wanted her to lock up the prescription medications over the weekend. And I remember the mother just said to me, you know, I will do this because I appreciate so much the support you've given me, but I think you're really making much more out of this than is necessary. But I then talked to her in follow-up, and apparently the girl had overdosed the next day. And while they were driving back from the emergency room, the girl apparently just turned to her mother and asked her, "Where did you put all the prescription medication? I couldn't find anything that worked." Now, I give this as an example, not because I'm trying to take credit for an astute clinical assessment, because I never met that adolescent girl. So it wasn't based on my clinical assessment. It was based on taking seriously any threat to safety, even in the context of grief. So I think we need to make sure people know that. But what I will say is that in the vast majority of cases, really what you have to do is just let them demonstrate how they're feeling and try not to judge it as whether it's normal or abnormal. Now, allowing children just to show their distress without trying to cheer them up is like really difficult for school personnel because they don't like to see children in distress. But that's really the work. That's what we have to do. Now, I've said some people don't want to say anything because they're afraid they don't know what to say. And some people are also worried that they're going to say or do the wrong thing because somehow they are ill-informed about another person's culture. There are differences in cultural practices, and there are various differences in cultures about mourning practices in particular, but the fundamental experience of grief is actually universal. So when we recognize there's a range of ways to experience and express grief across cultures, then we can explore ways to bridge cultural differences in order to help grieving children and families in a way that's meaningful to them. And what I tell people is just ask questions when you're unsure what's going to be most helpful for a family or individual. But the reality is that assumptions may result in stereotypes that cloud our perceptions and make us actually miss opportunities to be helpful. I had the opportunity to provide support for an Amish family by phone after one of the children in the family had died. And I was in the same community as the family lived in for a conference, and they asked me to stop by and have breakfast together. So during that day, I had the opportunity to spend some time in the household of the grandparents. And I remember the grandmother was walking me through the home and giving me a tour and talking about her family and her culture. And at one point she paused and she pointed to a framed picture on the wall. There was a picture of her daughter that had died. And she commented, the girl was like about 5 or 6 when she died. And she commented that she had this picture because one day the grandchildren were over and they were outside playing. And she said, I went to check on them. And when I went to check on them, I noticed there was a tourist who had stopped, and he was a photographer and he was taking pictures of my grandchildren. And she said, so I said to him, sir, please do not take pictures. It violates our religious beliefs and our cultural practices. We consider them graven images. It's inappropriate, so I'm going to ask you not to take photographs. And apparently her grandchild then said, Grandma, please let him take a picture. He's a photographer. He said he'd send me a copy. I really, really want it. I don't have any pictures. And she said she was actually so embarrassed that she just allowed it to happen. And then she paused and she pointed to the picture and she said, what a gift from God, because if I hadn't allowed it, I would never have this picture to remember her. Now, if I had entered into that discussion with the presumption that Amish do not use photographs as transitional objects when they are grieving because it violates their religious and cultural beliefs, which is accurate in general, but if I had conveyed that or presumed that in any way, how would this woman have been able to share with me that that's exactly what she's doing? So the issue is we should approach the family with an open mind and an open heart. Help them identify and communicate what's important to them about their cultural practices. And then we have to work with them to find solutions and compromises when the realities require some modifications in their cultural practices. For example, during this pandemic, it may not be safe to have families clean or prepare the body for funeral as their cultural practices might dictate they generally do. They may not be able to hold large funeral ceremonies, sit Shiva, or visit grieving families to bring over food. So what we've been seeing, though, is the use of virtual services, virtual Shiva. They even have services now that coordinate meal delivery to families through online services. And so we can ask them, what's important to you? What would you usually do? And then we can figure out what they can do in the situation. Now, I've spent all this time reviewing why you should say something and some guidelines on what not to say, but I haven't talked yet about how to actually talk with them. So let me go over how do we start the conversation. And many of you are school mental health providers, and this will seem very basic intentionally because I want you to be able to convey this to other people in the school setting. So the first thing is to express concern. Let students know you've heard about their loss and you're available to listen and offer support. And be genuine. Children can tell when adults are not being genuine, and they really want adults to be authentic in their communications. So if you tell a child you're going to miss her uncle, and then the child asks, have you met him? And you have to say, well, no, not really. That's not an authentic statement. But what you can say is, it makes me sad to see you experience the loss of someone I can tell you care deeply about. So it's an honest and authentic statement. Then invite conversation, and you can just use simple, direct, and open-ended questions such as, how are you and your family doing since your mother died? And then listen and observe. We want to listen more and talk less. You can share observations about students' behaviors or responses as long as you do that in a non-judgmental manner. For example, you can say, I've noticed that since your uncle died, you've been a lot quieter in class. I'm wondering, how are you doing? So you can observe things and share your observations, but do it in a non-judgmental way. As already mentioned, you want to limit personal sharing. You can draw on your personal experience, of course, to help you with your empathy and your understanding, but you need to focus on the student and the student's needs and experience. And you can also offer practical advice. For example, you can discuss ways to respond to questions from peers or adults about the death. Educators can actually talk with peers and help them learn how to become more comfortable supporting a grieving friend. So most children want to help their friends, but they often have limited experience supporting a friend who's grieving. And so they may make, as a result, insensitive comments, ask repetitive or intrusive questions about the cause of death, or sometimes even tease the grieving peer. In one study of children ages 6 to 15 who experienced the death of a parent, 20% reported that they had experienced direct, raw taunting about their loss. Peers may also just distance themselves from grieving peers in order to cope with their own anxieties or discomfort. So educators can actually help students develop skills to support a peer who's grieving by correcting misinformation and misunderstandings and helping the students understand how to be supportive of their peer. I went over what to say and what not to say. You can share that with children so they know how to start the conversation with a peer. You can give them suggestions of how they can be helpful and how they can support a peer, particularly during a complicated time such as the pandemic. And going back to this list, what you then want to do is offer reassurance to children without minimizing their concerns. Let students know that over time, you expect that they will learn to cope with their distress and that you're going to be there to help them through that process. And then maintain contact. At first, the children may not accept our invitations to talk or our offers of support. Their questions will evolve over time. What you want to do is remain available, concerned, and connected. Now, when supporting the grieving student, it's also helpful to identify and address guilt reactions. Young children tend to be very egocentric, and they assume that they control events through their actions and thoughts. They may also have a limited understanding of the true causes of death. So in order to make some sense of the death of someone close to them, children tend to elaborate explanations that rely on what we call magical thinking. And they assume there was something they did, didn't do, or should have done that would have prevented the death of someone close to them. And that leads to a sense of guilt. Even older children and adults often feel guilty when there's actually no logical, objective reason for them to feel responsible for a death. At some level, often unconsciously at least, it may actually be easier to feel responsible for something you did, didn't do, or should have done that caused or contributed to a death, rather than to accept it might actually have nothing to do with you. Because if it has nothing to do with what you did or didn't do, that means it could happen again to someone else you care about, and there's nothing you can do to prevent it. And that's just overwhelming to people. So they may accept guilt because it comes with an illusion of control, but that may provide some initial reassurance, but it's an illusion. And so it doesn't actually prevent the deaths of other people, and it leaves the person with guilt that impairs their adjustment. So children who experience the death of a family member during this pandemic may question how they may have inadvertently exposed a family member to the virus, how they should have picked up on symptoms before the illness became serious, or wondered what they ought to have done to get help earlier on in the illness. If you think about it, we've had so many fear-based messages during this pandemic. So I've heard comments made publicly saying things to children and youth. Well, you may be relatively safe from this virus, but if you go out and you visit with others, or you get too close, or you don't wear a mask, you could become infected and you could get someone you care about who's old or sick, and that might lead to their death. I've even heard comments such as, whenever you think about doing it, see the face of your grandparent and realize you might kill them. Well, when the grandparent does die, these kids are going to feel it's their fault. And so there's a problem with these fear-based messages. It leads to enormous guilt. Now, this guilt is extremely common, even among adolescents and adults. And so for that reason, I think it's important to reassure children and adults of their lack of responsibility. And even brief comments often can start that process. I did a presentation to a 3rd and 4th grade class, and I was talking about what happens when someone dies and how people adjust to it. And it was about 40 minutes long. And the teacher had the students write letters to me. And I remember one of the letters just said, "Dear Dr. Schoenfeld, thank you for coming to my class and talking about what happens when someone dies. Now I know it's not my fault my father killed himself." And then she just wrote, "Have a happy Valentine's Day," and signed her name. Now, I'm not suggesting that my comment was sufficient to actually deal with the guilt that the child was having, but it actually was enough for her to express it. And that's, as you know, probably the first step to be able to deal with it. Now, I don't want to imply that you can just talk away or convince people not to feel guilty after death occurs. That often does not work. And in counseling, when individuals persist with their guilt feelings, even despite our reassurances and our explanations, sometimes what you have to do is just allow them to own that guilt. Ask them, did you intend for this to happen? So far, everyone has told me, no, I didn't mean for this to happen. I feel responsible, but I didn't mean it to happen. So then I ask them, what is it going to take before you forgive yourself? And that's what we then focus on in the counseling. Now, let me turn to a couple of common types of concerns in general. And then I'll just spend a couple minutes talking about the unique challenges in the pandemic and then some resources. And I will remind you, as we're doing this, please enter some of your questions into the question and answer box, the Q&A box, and we will have time to discuss them. So the first thing I wanted to go over is academic accommodations. It's common for students to experience at least temporary academic challenges after the death of a family member or close friend. And quite honestly, you're just going to see this in the majority of students dealing with the crisis of the pandemic. Pre-existing learning challenges can become worse, but new ones can also develop. And there are many reasons for that. They can have trouble concentrating because of disrupted sleep, anxiety, depression, and other problems. They can have trouble learning, remembering, or applying new concepts. They can have challenges with completing homework. They may have competing obligations. I've been working in some school systems in cities that were deeply impacted, and some of the kids weren't attending virtual classes because they were out trying to earn money while their parents were unemployed. And they'll do that when the death of a caregiver has occurred, for example. They may have less availability of parental assistance to do their homework, or they may be watching younger siblings. And they can have just generally a disrupted home environment. They may also have had trouble demonstrating what they have learned on tests. Excuse me. So it's important that we offer academic support proactively. We don't want to wait for students to begin demonstrating academic challenges, and certainly we don't want to wait until they have academic failure before we offer support. Schools can and they should be a source of support to grieving or traumatized students, but if the academic expectations, even temporarily, exceed students' capacity to learn, schools are more likely to become an additional source of distress. So we need to assist grieving students in identifying the level of academic work that feels appropriate and achievable. And I've listed some modifications that you may wish to consider. You may, for example, want to change an assignment. So you might allow a student to work on a project with a partner rather than by themselves if it's hard for them to sustain their attention when they're working alone. But actually, some students find it hard to collaborate when they're grieving. and they might prefer to work alone instead of a group project. You might suggest a student change a formal research paper into a more engaging assignment, such as an oral history project or video project, if that will help them retain their attention. But grieving students may feel self-conscious or awkward, and they really won't want to stand in front of a camera perhaps, or give a verbal presentation in front of a class. So they might want to take an oral presentation and make it into a written assignment. I'm going over this not to just make it sound confusing, and I'm trying to raise the point that you want to accommodate the child and make the changes that work for the child based on how they are doing. And that isn't one set of type of assignments. It's really based on the child and their experience. You may also want to change the focus or timing of a particular lesson. So a literature class might choose a different book to discuss if the one originally scheduled describes a death similar to the one the student's actively grieving. A health class on the dangers of substance abuse might actually be postponed, or the grieving student excused if there's a student in the class that just lost a sibling to a drug overdose. You can also reschedule or adapt tests. Immediately after death, students might be exempted from some testing or given modifications, such as testing alone in a quiet location with extra time. The scores for tests, particularly those immediately after the death, might be omitted or weighted less in determining final grades. You can consider 504 plans, or if they're already in special education, modifications to their IEP. It's important that teachers, not just individually, but collectively as a group, all the teachers and extracurricular coaches, for example, that are involved in a student's life who's grieving, they should have some communication so as a group they can find a balance between maintaining reasonable expectations and providing the needed support. We do need children to achieve academically to the extent they can, so they're better prepared for the next year. But we have to make sure they can handle what they're experiencing now. I also wanted to talk about another phenomenon you'll see in classrooms, and that's referred to as grief triggers. Grief triggers are sudden reminders of someone who has died that can cause temporary but powerful emotional responses in children and adults who are grieving. Grief triggers can be anything that reminds children of a person that died. It might be the song their mother used to sing that comes up in music class, a country they visited on vacation with their cousin that is just mentioned in social studies, a poem in class that discusses in passing the friendship of siblings right after the death of a sibling, or just a reminder by a teacher for students to talk to their parents or guardians about something that was brought up in class. These are hard to predict, and they often catch children off guard. So one of the videos I often show when I do presentations in person is a teenage girl who was talking about her grief triggers with me. And she said that she was in biology class and they were studying blood vessels, and the topic of aneurysm came up, and the teacher asked if anyone in the class knew what an aneurysm was. So she said she raised her hand and she explained what an aneurysm was, but she didn't anticipate that the teacher then asked her, what can happen when you have an aneurysm? So she said, well, if the aneurysm is in an important or delicate organ such as the brain, if it ruptures, then the person might die from bleeding. And then the student just looked at me and said, it's just ironic. The teacher can ask a question that means so little to her and not know how much it means to you. Her father had died from a ruptured brain aneurysm. And she said, it's not the teacher's fault. She didn't know that was the cause of my father's death. It was a couple of years ago. But that was really hard for her to discuss in class. So then I asked her, have you had any other grief triggers? And she looked at me and she said, oh, actually one earlier today, right before I came here. I was talking to a friend after class, and we were talking about how hard the test was. And I made some joke like, I'm going to have a heart attack. And she said, and then my friend said, I'm going to have an aneurysm. And she started shaking. And the girl just looked at me and said, look, it's not my friend's fault. She's really a great friend. I didn't tell her that's the way my father died. So the issue is these can come up all the time, and they can be pretty overwhelming to kids. So what you want to do is come up with a plan on how you're going to do that. And you can also look at your curriculum and try and figure out how to reduce some of these triggers. I had one high school that I was working with after a mass shooting that had occurred, and they actually went through their entire curriculum, even before they reopened school, to try and remove grief and trauma triggers. Trauma triggers relate to the cause of death. Grief really relates to the loss experience, and you can see both. So, mentions about, they thought about, should they be teaching about the Holocaust? What could they do? And they did really thoughtful job of this. Actually had one of the students from the student newspaper contact me to discuss this. They had discussed it directly with the students as well. And she said, we're trying to figure out how we can do this. We do have, for example, a forensic science class. I don't know how you can eliminate all mentions of murder in a forensic science class. You can't. And so the issue is they're there in large numbers, but the fact that the school is actually thinking about that and talking openly about it, I thought was quite remarkable. But on an individual level, teachers and school personnel can explain to children that it's expected that these triggers are going to occur, and you can develop a safety plan with students on how to deal with them so they don't become overwhelmed in class. So here are some helpful responses to a grief trigger. You can provide a safe space or location where the student can go. For example, the school social workers or school counselors or school psychologist's office, or they can just go to the library or classroom across the hall. Or there can be an adult that the child can talk to even outside those professional groups when they're feeling upset and they want to talk. But you can also set procedures for how they can exit the classroom safely and discreetly, so that they can go speak with someone or go to that safe space. I had one teacher work out that whenever that student was having a grief trigger, he just walked to the doorway, took a tissue out of the tissue box that was near the door, and then walked out, and she knew where he was going and why he was going there and when he would be back. But you may not be able to do that during the pandemic. You can work out other ways of doing it. I had, for example, one teacher that I spoke to, and this student, her father had died, and so she worked out with the teacher that whenever she was feeling overwhelmed in class, she wore a hoodie to class and she put the hood up. And they referred to it as she was having a hoodie moment. And when she had a hoodie moment, the teacher agreed he would not call on her. And then when she was ready to fully engage, she just put the hood down. And the teacher just looked at me and said, I can trust that she'll tell me where she's at and when she's accessible and available for learning. And look, it's better than her just sitting home grieving by herself. She's at least getting some of the material, and we can give her support. So I thought that was really just a wonderful solution. I'm sure some schools don't allow hoodies in class, but you can come up with something else. And you can even do this during remote education. I taught on a virtual academic platform for a number of semesters, a course on how to support grieving students. And in those courses, and this was actually to graduate students, they were social workers, and there were a number of situations where they had experienced losses around the time of a particular class. And they would contact me and say, I'm going to the hospital, this person's likely to die, or I just experienced the suicide of a friend, etc. And I would always say to them, you know what, you don't have to participate in the class. You can do the work outside of the class. We can talk at another time. But actually in each case they wanted to. They said, this is really relevant now, I want to do it. And what we worked out was that they participated in the class, but they didn't turn their camera on. That way they could step away at any point. If they started to become tearful, no one would notice it. And there were other students in the class that didn't have their camera on because they didn't have the bandwidth, or they were at a placement at a school, they didn't have privacy. So we always had a couple students who didn't have their camera on. None of the other students had to even know the reason why. So you can be doing this with your students even during remote education. You can, though, if they're in school, you can let them call a parent or family member if they feel the need for it, or give them permission to talk with someone who can go over their feelings more, such as the school social worker, counselor, or nurse, or just offer private time to be able to talk with them. Staff, though, should also work with children and families to help anticipate and minimize the most likely grief triggers. For example, if you're going to do a project on Father's Day, I would say something like, we're going to be writing poems for Father's Day. Some of you may not have a father who's alive or currently living with you. You can still focus on your memories of your dad, or you can choose to focus on someone else, another male in your life who cared for you and has provided support that was meaningful. That way we can all do the activity. It's really a simple introduction. It recognizes not only that some people may have a parent who's died, but that they may have a parent who's deployed, incarcerated, no longer living with the family, or otherwise absent or distant in some way. And these are ways that we can help not only the children with loss due to death, but loss due to other causes. Now, while I've spent most of the time, as I planned, talking about just general considerations about how to support grieving students, I'm going to go very quickly through some unique challenges of supporting grieving students during the pandemic, and I'll end in just a minute or two telling you about the Coalition to Support Grieving Student Resources. And there is a document I'll show you how to download that goes over where you can find all the resources I'm mentioning, so I'll go quickly through mentioning those resources. Now, grief during a pandemic has some unique characteristics, and after the death of someone close, children in general often become more concerned about their health and that of others they care about. But in the setting of a pandemic, there's already extreme concern about personal health and health of others. So the ability to reassure children that others are close to them and healthy and not at risk of dying is very challenging during a pandemic. And this is the case even if the initial death was unrelated to the pandemic, or even to an infectious disease. So it's important to help children deal with their fears and concerns about the pandemic, in addition to the grief they experience after a personal loss. We have a COVID-19 pandemic resources webpage on the Coalition website that I'll direct you to, which has presentations and materials for educators, parents, and other professionals on how do you talk to and support children during this pandemic. And that will help address some of the concerns and anxiety related to the pandemic. As everyone knows, these physical distancing measures, including lengthy school closures, increases the social isolation generally experienced by grieving children. It just makes it difficult for schools to provide support using traditional means. This is certainly true, but it's also true that schools provide meaningful support when deaths from their school community occur during summer breaks and holiday breaks. And they do have mechanisms for using phone, email, and the internet to provide remote assistance, and you'll find that described in the Coalition materials. I will also point out that many children's bereavement programs across the country have quickly adapted to the pandemic, and they're providing virtual groups and virtual individual support. So you should contact the organizations in your area to see how they can assist. Now, if you are unaware of the children's bereavement centers and programs in your community, there is a listing of the National Bereavement Resource Guide that has a state-by-state bereavement listing. It was compiled by New York Life Foundation and Luna. And I will show you on how you can download a document that will have all those resources for your state and community. Secondary losses I've already talked about, but they can become even more of an issue during a pandemic. During the pandemic, with physical distancing and school closures, the magnitude and importance of all these secondary losses is often very accentuated. Families may find significant challenges to even meeting basic needs such as obtaining food, preparing meals, or providing supervision when a caregiver has died. And the usual outpouring of assistance, support, and companionship we normally see from extended family, friends, neighbors, and members of the school community is often lacking even in the immediate aftermath of a death. Funerals may be postponed and family and friends unable to visit. So we have a module that talks about these secondary losses and how to address them. Family members may also be just so overwhelmed by the pandemic in addition to their own grief. They not only have to deal with their grief, the surviving caregivers, but they have to deal with the impact of the pandemic, worries about their health, worries about their own adults parents that they have to care for, financial implications, and all the practical concerns I already mentioned. And all the extended family and friends are likely to be preoccupied themselves with the pandemic. So not only aren't they coming over to provide support, but they may not even be able to reach out remotely as much. And so schools often do provide some of the resources for meeting these basic needs. And that's a critical component of mental health support and bereavement support during a crisis. And some children's grief, I've been talking about grief due to bereavement, so that's loss due to death. But for some children who don't experience a death, they still grieve. They may have to cope with separation from loved ones because of hospitalization, quarantine, travel restrictions, or just inability to visit older relatives or friends. but they can also grieve their inability to celebrate their graduation, their birthday, special holidays. And transitions, such as from high school to college, are always particularly challenging for grieving students for a number of reasons, but they're particularly challenging right now during this pandemic. So we do have some resources that deal with coordinating services and supporting transitions among grieving students, as well as a module that we have on ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is all these other losses that aren't due to death. And then the last point I wanted to make before I spend maybe 3 minutes talking about resources and open it up to questions is that supporting grieving students can be difficult in the best of times. And let's be honest, this is not the best of times. And it's a really difficult but critical time to maintain your professional self-care. Some of the ways school professionals, though, meet their self-care needs is through the community of professionals within the school. And that's harder to do when you're not in session or when you can't meet with them in a lounge or speak to them in the hallway. So the impact of this pandemic actually is going to be a lot longer than people are prepared to accept. So it's critical we invest now in professional self-care. We do have a module on the website on professional self-care related to bereavement support. So let me just end by telling you just very briefly about some of the Coalition to Support Grieving Students resources, which are freely available to all of you. The Coalition is a unique collaboration of the leading professional organizations representing classroom educators. The AFT and NEA were two founding members, school administrators. We actually have the School Superintendents Association and 3 other school administrator organizations. And then the school, and then the professional organizations representing school counselors, that's ASCA, school nurses, NASN, school psychologists, which would be NASP, and School Social Work Association of America. The American Council of School Social Workers is a supporting organizational member. So all these groups came together probably about 7 years ago to create the coalition. They all helped develop and then endorse the materials. And that was launched, the website was launched about 5 years ago. And this slide just lists the founding members of the coalition. That's the New York Life Foundation and the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement that I direct. This slide actually lists some of the supporting organizational members. And as I mentioned, that's the American Council for School Social Workers is one of them, but it's also the American School Health Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Save the Children, Boys and Girls Club. We're actually up to over 100 organizational members now in the coalition. And we created this website. It's a free school practitioner-oriented website, grievingstudents.org, and it has over 20 video training modules, most of which are only 10 to 15 minutes in length. And I'll just point out, if you look at the kind of pink banner at the top, the COVID-19 pandemic response webpage, you click there, and that's where you're going to find all the resources that I talked about that are related to the pandemic. I'm not going to go into the website now, just for the interest of time, but we have over 20 video-based training modules. Most of the videos are 10 to 15 minutes in length, as I said. First one's 30 minutes because it includes some simulations of talking to a child when they first come back to school. We used actors for that. But you'll find that there are 6 different sections and they're listed on this slide. Each of the videos is accompanied by a handout and a PDF format that summarizes the major points of the module. So you see there are a whole range of topics. We have, grief during a crisis, the unique context of suicide, how to facilitate commemoration, memorialization, what do you do if a student or staff member has a potentially life-limiting condition. There's really a lot of different information up here. In addition to the video modules and all the print materials, the website has a lot of other resources, additional modules, what do you do specifically when it's a line of duty death in the police or military, different guidance documents that we've developed, training modules that you can use, family and school staff booklets, articles, and even online resources. And I'm just going to point out one booklet. This is After a Loved One Dies. This information is freely downloadable. It's in PDF format. It's in multiple languages. At this point, it's 3 languages, and we're working on many others. And you can order hard copies in English and Spanish. This booklet is for parents and other caregivers on how to talk to and support a child who's grieving. And it's available in hard copies free of charge, and even the shipping and handling is free. It's paid for by the New York Life Foundation. And you can download those off our website or order them through our website. Just click on the link under the pictures that says order free materials. You can also become a grief-sensitive school. That's the last thing I'm going to talk about. Interested schools can become grief-sensitive. Let me just go back. A grief-sensitive school is an accredited K-12 public or private institution that commits to help provide a supportive environment for students who've experienced the death of a loved one. To be part of this initiative, schools just need to pledge that they will become more grief sensitive, and that involves providing specific professional learning opportunities on an annual basis, sharing information with the school community broadly about grievingstudents.org, such as posting it on the school website, increasing awareness of the issue of grief at school. You get a cling, you can put it up in a window in the counselor's office, for example, post a logo on the school website, and agree to be listed on the coalition website. And then just review your relevant school policies and procedures. Those policies and procedures might be attendance, and all of these are optional, which ones schools wish to focus on. Make sure that attendance policies don't penalize students or staff for absences due to funerals. Communicate how you communicate with families of deceased students, how you handle commemoration memorialization, like considerations related to death by suicide. We have a document on our website now about how to support virtual memorials in schools during the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you do related to graduation? How do you acknowledge the deceased? Do you grant posthumous degrees to children who have fulfilled criteria? And then what do you do around yearbook and other end of the year activities, on-site funerals, wakes, and related services? There's a range of things. Schools are just invited to pick what they'd like. Grief Sensitive Schools Initiative offers presentations to school staff on and goes over these key resources. It's facilitated by about 2,000 New York Life ambassadors across the country. And actually, I think it's somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 of them. And schools that receive a brief presentation that just introduces the coalition, it's about 15 minutes long, and commit to make the pledge to become grief sensitive are also eligible to receive a $500 grant to help them enhance their ability to offer grief support and resources. And then you can join the MAP and see all of the other resources that all of the schools that have signed up to be grief sensitive. And I'm just going to end here. This slide provides contact information for the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement if people wish more information. So I'm going to stop it there, and then I think, Mindy, you're going to open it up to questions.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Schoenfeld. We appreciate you sharing your expertise and the fantastic resources, such excellent information. So we do have several questions in the Q&A pod. I will let Dr. Hannah West lead us through our Q&A portion today.
Hey, so we do have several questions. The first question that we have is, how can we minimize the chance of re-traumatizing or traumatizing students through crisis supports?
Okay, so obviously when you do talk about traumatic events, you do stand the risk of having them re-experience some of the feelings they had associated with the trauma. But before I answer that question, I do want to clarify, there is a tendency, I think, now to refer to distressing things as traumatic. And so I do want to clarify that there's trauma triggers and there are grief triggers. They are not the same thing. And so when we say re-traumatizing, what happens is that you want to help them deal with the loss. And so you need to talk about what they've lost. The trauma aspect relates more to how that loss may have occurred. So I don't really want general school personnel to be talking with children about trauma experiences, because what you want them to do is identify trauma experiences and trauma reactions. And then you want to refer them to counselors who actually are trained to deal with trauma. You don't want them to try and process their trauma narratives in classroom settings with untrained individuals. You do want teachers to talk about the person that they lost. So it's important we understand that distinction, because I think too much we say, if we bring up a death, we're going to re-traumatize them. So I have actually had now several schools where the administration did not allow the yearbook to include a picture of a student who had died because they thought that that would be a trauma trigger. And so the issue is, we do want to process the loss experience and the grief, but we don't want to do that in a way that re-traumatizes them. So what I would say is, individuals, one of the things that would be most upsetting is to forget that their children, forget their losses. They want to talk about the person that they miss in their lives. And that is not re-traumatizing. That's part of the meaning-making process and the way we acknowledge loss and deal with it. So just make sure, I guess the most important thing is to make sure you know what you're trying to accomplish and that you make that distinction.
Thank you. Kind of on that same line with that answer is, how do you suggest we support grieving teachers so that they can then support their grieving students?
So we need to recognize that the teachers are often more impacted than the students are in crisis events. Now, obviously, if a child experienced the death of a parent from outside of a pandemic, then the personal child may be experienced more. But when you're talking about events that affect the whole school or community, in my experience, it's almost always that the teachers are more impacted, and it's almost always that they get far less support. The attention tends to be on training them to take care of the needs of others without helping them deal with their own needs. In this pandemic, it's even more accentuated. The actual risk of illness is much higher among the adults in the school than it is among the children. And the adults often have other family members and friends who are more at risk. So I think what we have to do is recognize that and place reasonable expectations on the teachers. So again, my goal is not, we want to get this information out to them, but we also have to give the adults permission to say, I'm not able to provide the support myself. So we want teachers to help recognize when children can benefit from some help, but they don't have to provide it. If they're acutely grieving their own parent's death that week, for example, they may not be able to think about the needs of their students and put their own grief aside. All of us, that's the case. But it's okay to say, you know what, I have a student who's grieving right now, but I'm dealing with my own loss, and ask another teacher to talk to the kid, or better yet, ask a school mental health professional. So you can say to the child, I am so sorry to hear your mother died. That must be so difficult. Fortunately, I have a really good person here who can talk with you about that. Do I have your permission to put you in touch with them? So you don't have to do it yourself, but you do have to at least get to the point where you recognize it's a problem and you try and help them get the support.
Thank you. The next question that we have is, can you please address how to provide some of the supports you were talking about when doing a wellness check with a student virtually and they are triggered or breaking down?
Okay. So, well, first off, I guess it may feel easier in some way to do it in person, because then you can hug them, but quite honestly, even if they were in person now, you wouldn't be able to do that either. So in many ways, it's the same approaches that you do virtually. You just, if they cry, you can't hug them. You couldn't hug them in person anyway right now. So you can let them experience that. Obviously, the physical distance makes it harder for you to do your clinical assessment. It's harder. You have to use, sometimes you have to use more nonverbal cues. You don't have the mask, at least. So, there are challenges in every social interaction right now is hard. And so what I would say is you draw on your clinical expertise. And if you're not clinically trained, you draw on your human experience of being social. And if all you're trying to do is say, I'm sorry, and listen, I think you can do that remotely. I've actually found, for example, that some people do better talking remotely, and often they do better talking anonymously. I've been on radio talk shows, I've spoken with people on, they call in and they will tell you things that they wouldn't tell you in person. I remember talking to one woman, her husband had just died from suicide. She felt intensely guilty. It's a long story. He jumped off a building within an hour of being released from the inpatient psychiatric unit. She knew he wasn't safe. She took a shower. He found the car keys. He killed himself. And she just said to me, she's crying on the phone and she's saying, I can't talk to my children about this. I can't talk to anybody. I can't even share the guilt feelings I'm having. And I'm like, ma'am, we've never met. You're sharing them with me. And she goes, well, I can talk to you. And I go, we've never met. There are people like me in your own community, you know, but I think that she could share some really deep feelings with someone she didn't know who was at a distance. So yes, it is a challenge. I completely recognize that. But to be quite honest, all I really expect of people is to take the next step to do it a little bit better. Just make it a little bit easier for someone. That's all they're really looking for at this point. And we can certainly do that. Now, there's a whole nother issue about how do you assess risk of suicide and serious mental illness and depression remotely. And that's outside the range of what I was going to talk about, but we have actually worked with school systems on developing virtual remote assessments for suicide and what their policies and practices are. So I would encourage you to develop those policies and practices. So I don't want to minimize and say all of this is easy, but I think being compassionate with someone who's grieving, we can do that remotely. And I think you probably do it all the time.
Okay, what is a good way for us to be able to talk to our students virtually and get the parents to understand that our meeting is for the student and I only? I have a lot of parents who are standing in the background or sitting down right next to the student while we're meeting.
I would talk directly to the parents and say, I understand you're very concerned about your child, and I also know it's kind of hard to get privacy right now, but it's really going to be helpful for us to talk individually, and I'll talk individually with you alone as well. And I tend to just be direct and honest. I've had families, I remember talking to one mother, this was in a clinic visit. It was, you know, it was kind of challenging. They had just entered into kind of a sheltering in place in California where I am. We started earlier. She had actually filed for divorce right beforehand, and well, they canceled the court date. This was back in March, and I think she's probably still in that home. She found the husband to be very insensitive and verbally abusive to the other children, which was why she filed for divorce. One of the kids had autism, and their dog had just died that weekend, and he was really having a lot of distress. She actually went into her car in the parking, in the garage to have the conversation. So this is the only place I can be. I'm like, okay, we'll do it in the garage, you know? So, and she said, I want to move out, but I can't. He's frozen my checking account. I can't go, I don't have money to go anywhere. I can't go anywhere because of the pandemic, and it's falling apart in my household. So yeah, that is tough. And in some situations, you might actually say to the parents, you know, in order to preserve privacy, I'd like you to agree to go outside in your yard, or let's find a place where your child can be and we can talk quietly. And I would also reassure parents, if there's anything that I uncover in the conversation that I think it's urgent for you to know, I will take the responsibility of telling you that. And I will also encourage your child to talk with you. I always do that whenever I'm counseling, is I always encourage the kids to share information with their parents if they wish to, but I also honor privacy, of course, and the confidentiality.
The next question we have is, if parents request that the school does not share about the death of their child, what is the best way to help the school cope?
Yeah, so what I would say right now is you should always presume you have a child who's grieving in any classroom. You know, like I just presume it. And I tell people a lot of times they don't want to talk about it, and that is their right to do that. And so you should, quite honestly, you should just be sensitive all the time. I think that's what I try to do. I think educators should do that as well. I gave that example about Father's Day. That's just really easy to do. And there are lots of kids who, you know, don't have their father present for one reason or another, or their mother present for one reason or another. Same for Mother's Day, of course. So what I would do is always presume that's the case. And then I would invite students to talk if they wish to, and they may change their mind. They may keep it private, but they might go to a particular teacher or counselor and say, I don't want everyone to know, but I want you to know. And that's the best we can do. And then I think I just work with parents to explain why it would be helpful for us to be able to communicate. And what I try and tell people is, you just need to share that you'd like some help. You don't have to go over all the details about what's happening. And it's the same thing, by the way, among adults, professionals. We need to let people know, this is hard for me to do right now. Could you do it? We don't have to tell them why. So you can preserve privacy, but still disclose you'd like some assistance. And what we have to do, because I see this in schools all the time, where there'll be a school shooting and then kids will go down to talk with counselors and leave class. And the administrator says to me, we think some of these teenagers, they're just trying to get out of class because they don't want to be in math class. And I look at them and I go, so wait a minute, you have students that are going to therapists to talk about trauma and death, and you think they're doing that because they would prefer that to being in math class? I said, first off, if that's the case and they don't have a loss experience that you don't know about, or something else that's bothering them that they're now getting access for, and it's just that they think math class is worse than that, then you got a problem with your math class. And it might be the student has a learning disability, but kids don't do this for fun. And we also have to count on therapists to make sure that they're having their time used well. So if somebody keeps coming and there's nothing to talk about, it's their obligation to kind of raise that as an issue therapeutically. So I just tell people, know that you don't know everything and allow the services and supports to be given. And if you have doubts, you can say to a therapist or counselor or the social worker, this student left class 10 times to come talk to you. I don't think they even know the person that died. Could you just make sure that they're making good use of your time? Therapist doesn't have to say, oh, actually their mother died, but they didn't tell you. The therapist can say, I think they're making good use of the time. And then the teacher just has to trust. They just have to trust that that's what's going on. So that's how I would deal with it.
Thank you. We do have quite a few questions left, but we're running a little short on time. So let's see, we'll see if we can get one or two more in. How can a preschool educator help the class of children to process when a student has gotten very sick or died due to COVID?
Okay. So first, unfortunately, it is uncommon for preschool age children to die from COVID, but that is still, I guess it's still a possibility, but please understand that would be a rare, unusual experience. But they may die from other causes. So there's two things I'll just mention on that. First off, for very young children, they often don't understand what death means if you're talking about preschool age children. So in that booklet, After a Loved One Dies, we actually do have a section on children's conceptual understanding of death. It's not titled that, but it goes over how to explain death to very young children. And one of the modules is on concepts of death. I would say, please look at that if you're working with preschool age children. The other thing is there's a distinction between what you do with children who have a potentially life-limiting condition and what you do after children have died. And so we do have a module on those potentially life-limiting conditions. Point I'd like to make is you're not preparing the students for the death directly. You want to be very cautious about predicting death because time of death is hard to predict. Some people actually do survive very serious illnesses or don't die the year you think they might, or may not even die from that condition. So your goal is to help the children understand that they have a member of their class who is seriously ill and may have some problems as a result of the illness. So it's really on supporting the ill sibling to improve their quality of life and to help them get the support they need from the other children. And you are conveying that you're worried because it's a serious illness and the family is concerned it might not get better. So that then when the child does get, is in hospice or is on life support, then you can say it's gotten worse and we don't think they're going to survive. And then when you tell them the death has occurred, you have started that conversation already. But it isn't about talking about death with children who are in a class for a child who is seriously ill.
Then we have several questions briefly regarding access to some of the virtual assessments. So accessing protocols for assessing suicide online, or some of the virtual assessments that you've developed, and where they can access these resources.
Okay. I don't think we've posted how to do virtual suicide assessments. I do want to say, first off, there are some put out by the National Association for School Psychologists and other groups. I believe ASCA has also. We shared the guidelines that I was referring to around virtual assessments for suicide risk were done by one of the school districts in California that has given us permission to share it, and I can share that individually. I sent it to the board of directors of one of the professional organizations, and they shared it more broadly, but it isn't about the clinical part, it's about the procedures and policies. So it's more about if you have a student and you have a policy that if you think they're suicidal, you know, an adult staff member should stay with them until help comes. You can't do that virtually. So it's really more, you know, what are the guidance for dialing for 911, or who do you have that can do remote, who can act, you know, mobile units in some cities, who do you send out? So it's really more about thinking through your policies and general practices. It isn't about the clinical guidelines. The guidance documents that I talked about, those are on our website. And so they will either be at grievingstudents.org, and there's a search bar, so you can just search in the upper right-hand corner, or you can go to the National Center's website, which is on this last slide, schoolcrisiscenter.org, and there we have a lot of resources. So the guidance documents that I did refer to, a lot of the other policies like what do you do for end of the year activities, commemoration, memorialization, all of those are on our website.
Thank you. We do have a few more questions, but we're unfortunately running short on time. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. Chadwell.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Schoenfeld. Could you advance to the next slide? And then the next one. Yep, perfect. So we do ask, so all of our sessions are going to be recorded and made available on our website. It'll take about 1 week for those to get put up. Next slide, please. We do ask that you please take a moment to complete a brief survey about today's session. Your feedback is very important to us. You will be redirected to the survey when you close the Zoom platform, but it is also, there should be a link available in the chat box as well. Next slide, please. Thank you everyone again for joining us today. It's been our pleasure bringing this session to all of you. Please join us back in November for additional information. And a reminder that we have our next session today at 11:15 Pacific time, 12:15 Mountain Time, 1:15 Central Time, and 2:15 Eastern Time. So please join us for this networking opportunity. And Dr. Schoenfeld, you are also invited to join if that fits with your schedule too, with any of these sessions. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Schoenfeld, for all of your expertise and information.